In this course, we are going to learn the foundations of economics, starting with macroeconomics, which explains the economy as a whole and the different variables that play roles in economic expansion or contraction, and microeconomics, which studies factors of supply and demand and how these affect price levels and company strategies. We are going to learn how to calculate price elasticity of demand and how this applies to different pricing decisions in a retail business. So let's get started. Economics is the study of how people use scarce resources in the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. These resources include labor, tools, land, and raw materials. And because these resources are limited, we need to find a way to use them efficiently in order to obtain the goods and services we want. In 1776, Adam Smith published his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he introduced the concept of division of labor. According to this concept, instead of someone trying to do everything themselves, tasks can instead be divided among individuals. This way, all the tasks can be completed in a more efficient way due to specialization. Then those individuals can trade among themselves to take advantage of what others specialize in. For example, if you try to do everything yourself, you will build your own home, treat yourself from all illness, grow your own vegetables and other food. You will never have enough time and energy to do all of this on your own. Instead, you specialize in a certain task. For example, you could be immersion, buying and selling goods. Then you use the money you generated from your work and trade with others for the services and goods you need for your own living. You pay the doctor to treat you, and architect to design your home, and the supermarket to give you food, and so on. The same concept applies to businesses and nations. One nation or country cannot produce everything on its own due to the lack of some natural resources, and so it needs to trade with other nations by exporting what it specializes in and importing what it lacks. That's why economies are interdependent. And despite the fact that each member could be driving for their own interest, the whole gets to benefit due to the exchange mechanism that takes place. The study of economics is divided into macroeconomics, and this looks at the economy as a whole and studies concepts such as output, money, inflation, and price levels, and microeconomics, and this looks at how individuals and businesses interact within the economy and studies concepts such as supply and demand and pricing products and how it affects demand. Retailers need to be aware of both branches of economics. They use macroeconomics to understand the market overall and use information from the economy to put the right strategies for the business in the light of the current economic conditions and make accurate sales forecasts to build their budgets on. On micro level, retailers use the concept of supply and demand to understand the dynamics of the market and make the right decisions when it comes to pricing their products and implementing the right promotions. On a macro level, countries seek to maintain a healthy economy, and this can be seen in high living standards, low unemployment, and low inflation. To achieve this, there are different tools and measures that are applied to ensure stability and health of the economy. These are monetary policy, and this is implemented by central banks, and fiscal policy, and this is implemented by governments. We are going to get deeper into both measures, but first let's see how to determine the health of the economy and whether or not it is growing or contracting. The national output represents the total amount of goods and services a country produces. It also represents its budget constraint, because a country can only use more than the output it produces if it borrows the difference from other countries. The measure of the national output is called the gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country for a specific time period. Expenditures on goods and services are divided into 5 categories, and they are then used to calculate the final GDP. These categories are consumption by household, and this is C, investment in productive assets, and this is I, government spending on goods and services, and this is G, exports, and this is EX, and imports, and this is IM. The GDP formula is GDP equals C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM. So GDP is all the expenditures spent on final goods and services, excluding what has been imported. This graph represents the US GDP up until Q2 of 2022. The areas shaded in gray represent recessions. But what makes GDP grow? There are 3 basic sources of output growth: increase in labor, increase in capital, and increase in efficiency, or how labor and capital are used. For example, if a country started having workers stay longer at work and producing more goods and services, or if more people entered the workforce than before, this should lead to increase in labor and therefore increase in output. Same could happen if more capital is invested in more equipment and technology, which leads to more production or more efficiencies. That's why supply-side economists focus on methods to increase all those 3 factors in order to increase output. What makes GDP decline and so causes recessions or depressions? Anything that can happen and causes decline in the same 3 factors can lead to recessions. For example, if a natural disaster happened and prevented people from working or damaged equipment, this would lead to reduced output. However, there is another factor that can lead to economic downturns, and that is expectation. When people start to expect that the economy will decline, they hold back from buying and investing, because they expect that their money can buy them more in the future when prices decline. This is one of the possible explanations for the Great Depression that happened in 1929, which started with a sudden crash in the stock market and made people expect a recession and hold back from spending. So in this case, there was no shortage in production or supply. In fact, in his inauguration speech in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said, "Our distress comes from no failure of substance." And then he continued, "Nature still offers her bounty and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply." This is when economists started to realize that there is more to economic growth than supply. In fact, demand plays a very important role. And since it has become a main effort of the government to manage the demand side through its policies to prevent or shorten economic downturns and stabilize the business cycle. This is why during COVID-19, the government sent out stimulus checks and subsidized payment protection schemes to ensure people still had money to spend in the economy so it wouldn't come to a complete halt. When there is a decline in real GDP for an extended period of time, usually taken as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, a recession is announced. As we mentioned, governments and central banks use their available tools to try and shorten the time of recessions and restart the economy once again. Recessions are temporary, although some of them can extend for a long time if not managed properly. So it's important for any business owner or manager to understand that recessions do happen, and when they happen, the business needs to have a set of tools and strategies to deal with them until they play out. One of the things we want to stress on here is that, as we have seen, recessions can happen or be deepened by expectations, and the measures we take during a recession can actually exacerbate them. By holding back from spending or by cutting many jobs even more than what is necessary, this in return could lead to lower spending and even more depression. Instead, we want retailers during a recession to focus more on what they can replace and what they need to protect and maintain in the business, and then cut out the things that are absolutely necessary to be cut out. This helps in restarting the economy by protecting people's jobs and maintaining spending, and will shorten the time of the recession. As we have seen, economy works on exchange of goods and services between people, businesses, and countries. The mean for such exchange is money. Money, however, comes at a price. In fact, money has three prices. Interest rate, and this is the price of money relative to time. For example, if you borrow money, you pay more when you pay it back at a later time. This is called the time value of money and is based on the fact that $1 today is worth more than $1 next year due to inflation. Exchange rate, and this is the price relative to foreign currencies, and aggregate price level, and this is the price of money relative to goods and services. In other words, what can this money buy in terms of goods and services? When the aggregate price level increases, that's inflation. The same amount of money will be able to buy less products. But what could lead to inflation? When there is too much money in the economy, people tend to buy more. When their level of demand cannot be satisfied by the current supply of goods, sellers tend to raise their prices because there is still demand. And so, inflation happens. Inflation could quickly get out of hand and have a devastating effect on people's savings because now their savings will be worth less. That's why central banks use their tools to control inflation, by controlling the supply of money circulating in the economy. They often set a target for inflation. In the US and in many countries, this is around 2%, and try to keep it within this range by applying different tools that we are going to explore right now. But first, let's understand the role of central banks. A central bank is an institution that exercises authority over a country's monetary policy. In the US, this is called the Federal Reserve. Central banks use monetary policy to achieve the following objectives: maintain economic growth at the highest sustainable level, keep unemployment rate at lowest level possible, stabilize exchange rates, keep interest rates reasonable, and keep inflation low but avoid slipping into deflation. They do this by controlling money supply in the economy, and they have three monetary policy tools to achieve this: interest rates, reserve requirements, and open market operations. Using interest rates, the central bank can make money cheap or expensive to borrow, and thereby control its supply. When money gets expensive through high interest rates, people borrow less, and so demand will decrease, and this will control inflation and increases in aggregate price levels. On the other hand, when money is very cheap, that is, because of very low interest rates, people borrow more and buy more, which could lead to increase in prices. However, as you can expect, when interest rates rise and people start to buy less, this could lead to reduction in output, or GDP. Yes, there is a trade-off that happens here, and controlling inflation has a priority for central bank. When you make a deposit at a commercial bank, this bank then turns around and lends a portion of this money to someone who wants to borrow, and the bank takes interest. And in many cases, you take interest too. The commercial bank, however, cannot lend out the entire amount. It has to comply with the reserve requirement set by the central bank. Reserve requirement is the portion of deposits that must remain at the bank and cannot be lent out. Central banks can increase reserve requirement and thereby allow for less money to be lent and hence reduce money supply, or they can decrease the reserve requirement and thereby increase money supply. This is the second tool it uses to control money supply in the economy. Finally, the central bank can go and purchase financial securities itself on the open market, and this is called open market operations. For example, to increase money supply, the central bank can buy government bonds and other assets from private financial institutions, and thereby inject money into the economy. When it decides to contract the money supply, it sells those assets back into the market. Another tool that is used by governments to stabilize the economy is fiscal policy, which depends on government spending, taxation, and budget deficits. As we mentioned, expectation plays a big role in economics and could lead to reduced demand. In the times of downturns, the government could create demand itself by spending on goods and services and thereby increasing GDP. If this spending is financed by taxes, it could lead to lower consumer spending because taxes are increased on them. That's why this spending is financed by borrowing, and because in this case the government is spending more than what it collects in taxes, it is said to be running a budget deficit. This policy, however, is intended to be only used in times of contraction, because otherwise, if used in normal times, it could lead to inflation.